The Board of Nursing in New Hampshire states in their scope that RNs must have advanced training through CFCN, WOCN, AFCN. But it doesn't say you have to be certified, but it is recommended. They have an entire clause. All right, so is this the one you're looking at? Because I don't see anything about it written up. And so when you go to the Nurse Practice Act and you go under all of this, again, nothing is written up about foot care nursing. You're saying there's a clause. I'll believe you, but provide that to me and I will file that in my file, because I don't have anything for New Hampshire. I don't really have much for any state, to be honest. But this is something I want to talk about, because when you go to the New Hampshire website, you go to this thing called the decision tree algorithm, which helps you determine your scope of practice as a nurse. So when you go through this decision tree, which a lot of states have this, and so we're going to walk through this and kind of unpack it, because this is how I would read this if I was in New Hampshire. Is the nurse-related activity within the LNA scope of practice? Yes or no? Has the nurse-related activity been delegated to you by a nurse, APRN, or LPN? Well, as an RN, you're typically not getting delegated to by an LPN. So this is not going to be, this is null and void, this little entry here. So we're going to continue pass through that. Do you have the knowledge and the competence to perform the nurse-related activity? And here's where you would provide your education and your training, which is what most boards of nursing are going to want if they do contact you as a foot care nurse. They're going to know what kind of education you did have to create your business. Does the facility agency have the policy and procedure support the nurse-related activity? You're not working for a facility or an agency, you're working on your own, so that's null and void again. Are you prepared to accept responsibility to perform the nurse-related activity? And this is where it gets into, you figure, are you prepared to accept the responsibility? That to me says, do you have a consent? Are you charting? Do you carry the appropriate liability insurance? That's what that says to me right there. So if I was a nurse coming to the New Hampshire Board of Nursing and looking at this, I would have used this decision tree and been like, yep, I'll build my business. Now, I don't see anywhere in here where it says that it's recommended to have the certifications. I know in the past that there were a couple states that had recommended different certifications, and it was still only recommended, not required. And those states have since removed the required or the terminology around the certifications. And I think the reason they did that was because they found that that was restraint of trade. When you start to list entities who are the providers of the certifications, you get into restraint of trade, because honestly, we could all say we're certifying. Every person teaching foot care nursing could say, yeah, here's your certificate, here's your certification. The difference is that when you get into certifications, you get into what is accredited and what is non-accredited. The accredited certifications, such as the CFCN, was created by the Wound Ostomy, WOCN, many years ago, because they were trying to put foot care nurses in the hospital system. They were trying to cross-train the wound care nurses because they were seeing a lot of infections with lower extremity patients that were coming in, due to diabetes and all that kind of stuff. So they were trying to cross-train the wound care nurses to doing foot care. So they developed this certification, the CFCN. They became accredited through the ANCC, that is the American Nurse Credentialing Center. WOCN then became their own accrediting body of knowledge, and they now do their own accrediting. So what does that mean? How do you become an accredited certification? So to become an accredited certification, you typically create your education, your training program, you create your testing, and you then create your body of knowledge with a board overseeing all of that. How do you create the board? The board is created by the public entities. So it would be like foot care nurses electing people to be on that certain board. You would have an election process, and then you would basically have your board built up. You don't just pick and choose who's going to be on the board. You have a process to this. And then what you do is you build your manuals, your teachings, your testing, and you take all of that and you apply to the ANCC, or you apply to, the other one is the ABSNC, the American Board for Specialty Nurse Certification. You then take your package, your box of information, and you deliver it to them. You pay a huge fee to have this accreditation process started. You then get credentialized or none, or you don't get credentialized. They either say yes or no. And so there's no guarantee, even if you apply to this and you're like, I want to be a credentialing certification process and there's no guarantee that you're going to get credentialized, but it's a hefty fine. I have I know people who've worked in the ANCC, and I know the inner workings of it, and so it's a lot. I looked into it many years ago when I launched the Foot and Nail Institute, because I thought, should I become a credentialized body of knowledge? It's a huge undertaking, so I understand why some people choose not to do that. So what happened is they basically had these certifications that they were requiring for the foot care nurses inside the hospital system. It didn't work in the hospital system because it wasn't executed appropriately. And we've heard of the stories of where they started to do the foot care nursing inside of the hospitals and how that did not go right. And that's a whole other video in itself. But so the confusion began that then people started believing that they needed to be certified to be a foot care nurse. And so some people chose to go with that and say, yep, you need to be certified. Here you go. You can buy my certification. I could have done that with my stuff, but I chose not to because I wanted to be transparent with nurses, because I wish somebody would have been transparent with me as a nurse and helped me decide what was best for me. If you feel it is best in your best interest to have that certification, have it. By all means, have it. But I do think that people and nurses need to know that there is a difference. There, you can have it or you don't have to have it. Completely up to you. I think that the inner workings of the certification process is a lot. And I think that, when you get into third-party testing by independent organizations, that is what makes your certification credentialized. And so for these hospital systems, they want those certifications because they check a box next to your name, and that's how they get magnet status. And that is the end of it. When you go into these boards of nursing, they're just throwing it out there and like, yeah, sure, let's put that in there. I think when they get challenged on the listing of the entities of who is the provider of those certifications, then they backpedal and they remove it from their websites, because I've seen that happen over the years where they've had different certifications listed and now they're gone. They're not there any longer. And I think that's because they got contested, most likely is what ended up happening. And somebody said, wait a minute, can't have specific entities, businesses, or academia listed as the provider of it. Here in Ohio, we just had the process of the doula stuff, and it was interesting because I watched that process and I thought this will be interesting to see how they go through the process of creating the certification for the doulas, because it's most likely going to run parallel for foot care nursing. What the end deliverable was at the end of all of that was, if you want to be certified, be certified. If you don't want to be certified, don't be certified. If you're going to go in the hospital and provide doula type services for labor and delivery, you needed the certification. And I think that's what's going to end up happening with foot care. If you want to go in the hospital and provide these services, then you need to be certified. But out here in the community, do you need it? No. And I think that's what's going to end up happening. And most nurses who start foot care businesses don't want to go in the hospital anyway. We are using foot care nursing as a way to escape the hospital system. So no, we're not going to want to go back into the hospital system, provide services. If we get out of there, if we build our businesses appropriately and we do good and we are successful in our businesses and we've duplicated and replace that income, we're not going back into the hospital system. So that's kind of my spiel on the certification process and such. But if you do have that clause, send it over to me and I will add it to my file. I have a little file for foot care states and nurses in different states and such, but I don't have anything for New Hampshire and I don't see it on here. I would hope that they would put it on here if that's indeed the case, but if not, I don't know where it's at. It's not available for the public or nurses to find, so it's kind of weird. So let me know. Have a good day.